It's wiser to judge someone on their deeds as opposed to their words. But this is not the highest wisdom, as we haven't considered the actions in their contexts. It is not always clear whether bad deeds are actually bad. We just go on what they look like, whether the deed and its perpetrator appear bad. The disturbing reality is, we cannot know each other's intentions for sure, and thus end up making potentially lethal prejudgments. There's the little blighter, called a drawling British accent. Marked? A Russian accent promptly responded, and fired off an expertly timed round from a rifle. Wood and bark shrapnel exploded from a thick, aged tree on impact. The stinging rush of debris caught Enoch entirely unawares, jamming the brakes on his not-so-expertly planned attempt at escape. He was thrown onto his back like he weighed nothing at all, letting out a pitiful whimper on the way down. "Why are they always so slippery, eh?" the British voice said, winding his way through the trees towards the downed teenage boy. He spent too long watching TikTok. Now he can't even watch where he's going, the Russian voice said disapprovingly. The Russian reached down and grabbed the scruff of Enoch's coat and roughly dragged him to his feet. He managed to stay standing, but not exactly steadily, as a few tears mixed with the mud caked on his face. He stared despairingly at the ground. "We'll have to bring him back dirty now," the Brit dryly observed. "You can clean him," the Russian replied. The Brit considered the proposition for a moment, then shrugged. "As long as he isn't broken, I reckon we'll be fine. Please, just let me go." The boy sniffed between soft sobs, his voice so feeble, so quiet, that it could barely be heard. The Russian pulled down a hood, revealing a naturally smooth-textured female face, contorted into a labyrinth of disgusted wrinkles. "How dare you?" she breathed, as if she could hardly believe what she was hearing. She stood to her full height, paused for a moment in which no particle of air seemed to move. Then she slapped him with the inside of her hand. It was closer to a punch than a slap. The boy yelped and staggered backwards, grabbing a nearby tree for balance. "I said as long as he isn't broken, Sveta," the British man sarcastically said. "This better not get our pay docked," he continued. But she had already turned on her heel and started walking away. "Come on, you," the Brit sighed, grabbing the captive under the arm and dragging him along beside him. The uncomfortable march back to their van was punctuated only by the sniffs and snuffles of the boy, and the echoing splashes of him spitting blood out of his mouth onto the ground. The birds seemed to fall into a gloomy silence as the trio paraded past. Perhaps even they simply did not know what to say. "Put him in the back, Ben," she said crisply as they came up to a black van parked on a dishevelled forest road. "Gagged." "Right you are, Sveta," he replied. Something about this boy had really gotten under her skin, but he knew better than to ask. Sveta never discussed personal matters. Even after 10 years of working together, Ben just about knew her name, and he wasn't entirely convinced that it was her real one. Ben turned to the boy and told him to get in. He hesitated, so he gave him a sharp kick up the backside and sent him tumbling into the back of the van. "Don't get blood on the carpet," he ordered. "Takes ages to scrub it out." Ben climbed in alongside him and rammed a ball of fabric in his bloody mouth, and with a cloth, secured it around his head. Sveta, in the driver's seat, turned on the engine, and they were on their way. For most of the several hours long journey, Enoch sat limply on the seat, his head lolling awkwardly to the right, his breathing laboured under the muffling of the gag. The entire time, however, Enoch's eyes remained permanently fixed on Ben, who was growing ever more unsettled despite himself. Enoch's eyes looked to some degree as Ben expected, afraid, full of tears, the general gaze of the captive, but there was something else and Ben just did not have the words for it. He kept trying to strike up chat with Sveta to distract him from his dour passenger, but she was in an even less talkative mood than usual. Eventually, it got too much for him, and he yanked the gag out of the kid's mouth. Enoch inhaled deeply, surprised at the small act of mercy. But beyond stiffening up a little, he didn't move, and he didn't speak. He just watched Ben intently, wondering what it was he was about to do. "What's your deal, kid?" he asked quietly, not wanting to irritate Sveta. "You tell me," he rasped in a tone which suggested that when he was in better sorts, that he was quite the cheeky article. "Nobody seems to like you much," Ben observed. "You must. You kidnapped me." "Just doing what I'm paid for." "You kidnap people for your job?" "I've got to make a living somehow, but nobody ever tells me why. Don't ask usually, but sometimes I get curious." "You're sick," he coughed. "And well paid for it. How about this? You fill me in, and I'll give you this." He produced a bottle of water. Enoch's eyes darted towards it. He was very thirsty. His mouth was encrusted in blood, and his throat was dry. But Enoch said nothing. "Carrot's not enough for you? How about a stick?" Ben asked, his mouth sharpening into an unsavoury smile. He pulled out of a pocket a switchblade, which he flicked open and let Enoch's eyes absorb its silvery glint for a few moments. "I don't reckon our client needs you with all 10 fingers intact. Maybe I'll take one as a souvenir," he wondered out loud. Enoch stiffened, the blade getting his heart rate up beyond its already thundering pace. "Choices, choices, choices," Ben mused. "Get a bottle of water, or meet Mr. Knife. Tough call." Enoch's shoulders drooped as the will to resist ebbed. "Okay, sicko," he said, when Sveta's authoritative voice interrupted him. "We'll be there in 5 minutes. Get him out of sight, Ben, just in case." Kicking into action, he grabbed Enoch, re-gagged him, and then started to put a large black sack over his head. "Perhaps we'll chat another time," Ben said, before dropping the bag, making him look like a black ghost at Halloween. "Sorry, mate," he went on to say, "but we need you to be quiet." He brought out a short, stout club from a box under the seats and deftly struck Enoch on the back of the head. With a grunt which sounded like a dying vacuum cleaner, he hit the ground flat. Ben then kicked the captive's limp mass under the seats and out of sight. Sveta slowed down as they passed through a road covered by dense trees. Signs saying private property were peppered along the roadside with the glinting eyes of CCTV cameras. The area seemed abandoned. But Sveta knew the reality was anything but. Being on scene was a speciality around here, and in it, they excelled. After a few minutes, they pulled up outside an electric gate. From a booth beside it, a security guard strode slovenly over and shone a flashlight into the driver's side window. "Identification," he grunted sleepily. Sveta showed the card that their employers had issued to them just for this purpose. "All right, straight ahead, take a left, then a right, and park in the bay with a sign saying guest deliveries. Have a good night, ma'am," he recited in a bored voice, pressing a button on the device in his belt. The gate ground open as he returned to his booth, likely for another nap. They followed his instructions, passing richly decorated buildings made with textured local stone, clinical-looking square buildings, and various outdoor meeting spaces. The entire complex was bathed in a not unpleasant white light from street lamps, and the place was abuzz with activity. People walking, chatting, milling around, drinking and relaxing. "I hate this place," Ben complained. To him, it always seemed too happy, too perfect. He was always suspicious of utopianism. The world was a bitter, violent place full of human animals. These freaks who hid themselves away to live a seemingly idyllic existence. He was prepared to bet a fortune they had some serious skeletons in their closet. They did hire him, after all, to kidnap a child. Hypocrites. At least he admitted that he was a monster, which was better than most. "They're waiting for us," Sveta observed. Indeed, a number of identically dressed men stood near the entrance to a covered parking bay. They were waving for the van to pull in. Sveta stopped, swung around, and reversed the van into the bay. And the moment the entire van had passed the threshold, the doors began to close, sealing them inside. "They're running a tight ship this time round. They don't want their zombies to see us dragging a body around, do they?" Ben noted wryly as the strangers hammered on the back of the van door. He reached underneath the seats and dragged out the now slightly stirring and quietly groaning teenage prisoner. He opened the doors. "Evening, gents," he said. The expressionless faces looking back at him said a lot. "Please remove the subject," the leading man, so generic as to almost seem invisible, said, eyeing the van with disinterest. "If you say please." There was no response. Ben shrugged and tossed the bagged boy out. He landed hard on the concrete garage floor, letting out a gasp of pain and shock. "Merry Christmas," he said sarcastically, and went to get back into the truck. "You will take the subject to the depository," the bland man continued. "Say what?" Ben asked, looking around. "Look, mate, the contract was for one kidnapping and one delivery. Nobody said anything about dragging—" "Ben?" Sveta said, having rounded the corner of the van, giving him a familiar hard look, which always meant, "Shut up and do it." Grumbling, Ben grabbed the end of the sack, with which was now squirming like a land-bound fish, and began to drag it along behind him, as he followed the maximally uninteresting fellow in front of him. Sveta followed somewhere along behind. "Nice decor," Ben remarked, as they left the garage and entered an atrium, which bore a startling resemblance to a swanky hotel lobby. The sack caught on the threshold of the entrance. With a sharp yank, Ben pulled it over, causing Enoch to yelp in pain as his head bumped off the ground. The space was full of a well-dressed selection of pale-skinned, hook-nosed partygoers, many with champagne glasses in their hands. Ben was immediately struck by how closely they all resembled each other, like some sort of enormous family gathering where everyone was a little too closely related. He noted to himself that the place only got weirder the more he saw of it. When they got into the middle of the atrium, the crowd had noticed their cargo, and predictably went totally silent and stared. However, it was not shock and horror at seeing what was obviously a distressed youngster in a bag. It was a poisonous and deep-reaching hatred. The silence soon broke into a cacophony of hisses, boos, and jeers. As they continued to move through the crowd, some closest to them took the opportunity to kick Enoch as he passed, causing little waves of laughter to erupt from the crowd. By the time they had crossed the room towards another door, the unmistakable sounds of desperate, harrowing sobs throbbed with every step they took. They left the room into a long, more sterile-looking corridor, which was nearly precisely circular. The sign on the door said, "The Ring." On the outside of it were doors leading to various other places, but on the inner side was a continuous glass window which looked out on an artificially lit stone structure. It looked like some sort of medieval tower, at least what they looked like in the movies Ben had watched. The confusion and curiosity must have been obvious in his face, because Sveta caught up with him and said, "This building was built around the depository, to protect it and keep it out of sight." "What? You know what this is?" Ben asked, astounded. Sveta nodded. "I know this place well. I was born here." The uninteresting man stopped, turned around and gestured to a door that led through the only break in the endless window. "Through here, please." Ben swallowed, nodded, and dragged the bag behind him to the inside of the ring. The first thing he felt when he crossed the threshold was the drop in temperature. It felt like he were outside, even though the place had a roof. They were standing on a wooden bridge made of what looked like tree trunks strapped together with rope. Below was a moat of some sort, but it was flowing like a river around the circle without stopping. He had no idea how that was possible, and he was too unnerved to entertain it for long. As it turned out, dragging the sack over the bridge was no easy task. Each log required a yank, and each yank was highlighted by grunts of pain from Enoch, whose body was being battered with every stride. Halfway over, Sveta put a hand on his shoulder. "Wait up a moment," she said, her voice unusually heavy. Ben gladly stopped and let the moaning bag drop. "This is about the craziest thing I've seen in my life. What the bloody hell have you signed us up for?" he asked as he wiped sweat out of his eyes. She walked in front of him and looked him almost tenderly in the face. He found this nearly as unnerving as their peculiar surroundings. "Do you trust me, Ben?" she asked, with a sincerity which seemed alien on her lips. "Yeah," he replied unsteadily. "With my life. I mean, we're a thing. We cover each other's backsides." "Then trust me on this. That boy," her face scrunched up in disgust, "is no good. He's a monster." "He's a kid," Ben countered. "What could he have done to make these pack of Wallies want us to kidnap him and bring him to what looks like Camelot crammed inside the Ritz Hotel? It's not something I can explain. You'll have to see it. Look, all I need you to do is do what they say and don't ask any questions. And you'll get 3 million up front for your trouble." "3 million?" he blubbered, shocked to the core. 3 million, Sveta reaffirmed soberly. "I can't... What? Oh my God." "Trust me, Ben," she said. There was a long pause amid the sloshing and slapping of the indoor river below them. "Okay, you got it," he assented, the idea of such riches peeling back his immediate apprehension. "Just don't ask, and I get rich." She then stunned him even further by enveloping him in a hug. "Thank you," she said, and for a moment Ben thought her eyes looked somewhat watery. Ben grabbed the sack once again and continued the pain journey towards the out-of-place stone structure. The stones were dark, but their texture was closer to glass than rock. But they did not shine like glass, but they were at the same time still reflective somehow. It was also clear that the structure used to be part of something much bigger, as remnants of walls and disused doors protruded out of sections of the tower, suggesting they were once connected onto other things. Directly in front of them was a tall, arched doorway, which he thought once might have held a wooden door. It was, however, now just left open and gaping. He almost expected the tower to start breathing. The money-induced euphoria of a moment earlier was quickly being suffocated as he got closer to the dark mouth. "Sveta?" Ben said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "It's okay, Ben. It won't bite." He wished she would have used another phrase, but beyond appearing frightening, The atmosphere closer to it seemed different, like the air weighed a different amount than normal, or that there was more gravity or something. Ben felt like he was being pressed downwards by the very presence of this edifice. Even Enoch had stopped making noises of protest. Perhaps the mood had even seeped inside his sack, or maybe he'd simply passed out. Regardless, he was now silent. 2/3 of the way over the torrent, he noticed that all across the tower's body was a faded inscription. An enormous image of some sort, etched into the glassy stones. It looked like a snake, winding its way upwards, and at the top, instead of a snake's head, was that of an oversized lion. Although comical in proportion, and nowhere close to realistic, there was something about the snake lion's eyes which made Ben want to look away. He started to feel like he did as a small boy, when the lights went out at night after he'd watched a creepy film. He didn't want to stare into it, for fear of what he might discover, staring back. Over the arched doorway were a series of letters. They looked Russian, but older, kind of like the lettering he'd seen on old Orthodox churches. He squinted to see if he could make it out. He'd worked in Russia long enough to have a decent grasp of the language, but he struggled this time. "It says, Yal de Boath," Sveta informed him as they passed under the door. "Who's Yabba de Hohath?" She gave him a hard stare. "Right, no questions." When they passed the threshold, there were a number of darkly clothed and masked men blocking the entrance to various rooms and corridors. They wordlessly gestured towards the direction they were to go in. They were led into a corner room, which had seemingly been turned into a type of restroom. There were seats, snacks, a toilet and a shower. The dull man from before had made his way in behind them. "We'll be ready in a few hours. Please make yourselves comfortable, freshen up and prepare the subject." He then disappeared from the doorway. The next few hours were both disturbing and domestic. They removed the captive from the sack and forcefully bathed him, removing any blood and dirt. Sveta even shaved his hair to a rough fuzz. The entire time he struggled and panicked and cried. Something about being in the tower had scared him into blatant incoherence. Ben marveled at the strength he showed when struggling. "Are you serious this kid's only 13? Ben asked, after he'd been kicked hard in the face and felt his right eye closing over. Eventually, he was cleaned and forced to wear, at the threat of Ben's knife at his throat, a type of black gown, and on it was a golden stitching of a 2-pronged pitchfork. "Looks kinda like Neptune's thingy," Ben said. "That's a trident. This is a bident," Sveta corrected him. "It's time," the dull man's voice said, making them all jump. "You heard the creepy geezer," Ben said to Enoch, who had scrunched himself into a corner, shaking violently. "It's time." He hooked him under one arm and Sveta under the other, and they force-marched him out of the room. "Oh, please, let me go," he said, making coherent words for the first time in hours, as he swung his body back and forth to try and escape. "You're more trouble than I was as a kid," Ben quipped, stamping on Enoch's toes and making him yelp. "Now walk, son. It's less painful that way." Ben had no idea if it was or not. Nonetheless, he was slightly more compliant. "Ben," Enoch said, his voice suddenly calmer, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to do what she tells you." He thrust his head towards Sveta. "You don't know anything, kid," Ben replied. It looked like he was about to retort, but before he could, they had arrived at their destination, and it was truly bizarre. It had an outline like a Greek theatre, with there being tiers, which led down to a flat bottom. Hanging down from somewhere above was a black mass, highly glossy, and resembled a misshapen hourglass, but the entire thing was entirely composed of some wispy, cloud-like vapour. Along the tiers were sat more of the masked weirdos, and on a raised plinth sat one with a golden mask above the others. He raised his hand and pointed down to the flat area at the bottom. Feeling supremely unsettled, the trio made their way down through the silent masked ones, down below the great black thing, which from below looked like a vortex of oily storm clouds. Enoch began to scream so loudly that Ben resisted covering his ears. It was so loud, so shrill, and so persistent that he was astounded how it wasn't tearing open his throat. He resisted the urge to shove the boy away from him. His terror was somehow terrifying. "Hades, take your throne," came a ghoulish, echoing voice. It was the golden mask. "Put him in the chair," Sveta hissed at Ben. Beside them was an empty, ancient-looking ornate wooden chair, covered in those same old Russian letters. Decorating it were images of the same bident on his gown, and running up and down the legs was the serpent with the lion head from before. The moment Ben went to shove him into the chair, Enoch attempted one last chance at escape. He rammed into him with a force only mortal desperation could produce, and Ben stumbled, but he was a veteran, and he managed to stay on his feet. Having been in more fights than he could count, he responded instinctually and smashed Enoch straight in the face with his fist. The boy sealed backwards and crumpled into the chair as 3 of his teeth clattered across the floor. One even struck the legs of the nearest masked spectator, who wiped himself down as if it were diseased. Following Sveta's lead, they bound the stunned Enoch to the throne. Once he was secured, Ben bent over, breathing hard, feeling terrible. He felt Sveta touch his elbow in reassurance. "And bring him his bride," the echoing voice pronounced. Ben looked up. Across the floor was another chair, almost identical, but with slightly different decorations. Most were iterations of a snake eating its own tail. Being led out from a hidden doorway by 2 of the masked was a girl, roughly about Enoch's age, dressed in a white gown with a silver embroidered bident. She went without struggle or coercion, sat herself on the opposing throne, and stared across at them. "Tatiana!" Sveta called, showing a love and concern Ben didn't think she was capable of. The mysterious girl squinted through the gloom at her. "Mama?" she asked. Sveta ran across the room. Ben was about to follow when she shot him a look which said, "Stay there, Ben." She went over and embraced the girl, and they shared obviously excited words that he could not hear. After a few moments of this, the golden mask seemed to be getting impatient, so with a last hug, Sveta crossed the room again and stood on the other side of Enoch, who was violently twisting his neck to avoid looking at the girl who so intently gazed at him. "Let me out, Ben. Please," he gasped, staring up at him, his voice pained and laboured. "What did I do to you, Ben? Is this worth the money they're giving you? Please, Ben. Please." Ben was far from being stirred to pity, being the hardened criminal that he was. But something in the boy's tone did strike him. Something about his fear was different than the fear of someone about to be handed over to a vengeful gangster or enterprising human trafficker. It was a type of fear far beyond what Ben could ever hope to understand. "Groom, behold your bride," the golden mask boomed impressively. The black mass above started to churn hard at his words, making it feel like gravity were moving with it. "It's not too late, Ben," Enoch begged. "You took her in the deep past, and she did not belong to you. She is here now. Come out and have her," the voice continued. "You can't let them. You can't. You don't understand what will," he begged, tears rolling down his eyes. "If you shall not come out willingly, we shall bring you forth by force." The golden mask roared, and the spectators uttered some strange chant. The black mass above began to change shape, and the lower part of it distended like some sort of dynamic chewing gum, but made of cloud. "There's no more time, Ben. Don't do this just because she told you. She's never going to slob on your knob, Ben. Don't listen to her. She'll never be yours, Ben. Ben, please let me out." The dark vapour solidified into a perfectly reflective black bident, a two-pointed spear which seemed supernaturally sharp. Ben stared at it, his sense of reality now entirely gone. He was too scared to question it. He was almost as scared as Enoch. Ben knew he was a bad man, but he was the type of evil that was very much in the domain of man. This, whatever it was beyond human evil, beyond his type of evil, and it terrified him. "Executioner!" the golden mask roared, and to Ben's unmitigated horror, pointed directly at him. "Pick up your weapon." He then pointed to the dark bident hovering ominously in the center of the room. Ben didn't move. He was frozen. He didn't understand. "Sveta?" he croaked, suddenly aware he was being stared at by over 100 dangerous nut jobs. She gave him a particular kind of nod that she only gave when she was ordering him to do some seriously nasty business. The last time he saw that expression was when they were contracted to kidnap that mad woman Brianna in Ukraine. Sveta had ordered him to shoot her boyfriend's brains out right in front of her, which he was extremely loath to do. But he of all people knew you did not say no to Sveta when she gave an order like that. Highly reluctantly, Ben moved towards the bident, feeling like the many eyes watching him were physically pushing him along, their will reaching into his chest and puppeteering his body. He was their instrument, and they intended on using him to deadly effect. After the longest walk of his life, he reached the unnatural weapon, and wilting under the hellish gaze of the golden mask, he grasped its shaft in his hands. It instantly stopped floating and had weight. The perfect weight for him. He immediately felt this was the best melee weapon he'd held in his entire career of violent crime. Now sacrifice the innocent, so that the guilty has nowhere else to hide. The golden mask boomed. The bident in hand, he noticed the girl on the throne across the room smile at him. She clearly approved. "You want me to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The girl cheerfully declared, "Yep." Turning around, his head bowed as if in prayer, he faced Enoch, the boy he abducted. He raised the bident so it was pointing forward, and he took a long, slow breath in, trying to think of the 3 million and not of the lunatics he was surrounded with. He gritted his teeth, already certain he was going to regret this, and ran full pelt towards the child. "No, Ben, no, please stop, don't do—" Enoch screeched, wild terror in his voice as he gave one last burst of energy trying to break his restraints. Before he was finished, he was utterly silenced as the bident went through his chest like it were butter. The 2 prongs shot out the back side of the wooden throne. Nobody breathed. Ben slowly released his hands from the bident, which rigidly held itself in place, jutting out from the 13-year-old's abdomen. His hands shaking wildly, he backed off and sunk to his knees. Enoch's eyes followed him and looked into his own as blood poured out of his mouth, and his eyes lost focus and rolled lifelessly into the back of his head. Ben began to think that the darkness and silence was hell. He was the one who was dead, and this was his punishment. But soon, it was broken by the golden mask. "There's nowhere left for you to cower, Hades. We see you." The masked crowd stirred a little. Sveta walked up to Enoch and with a sharp tug, yanked the bident out of his body. It instantly dissolved into black, vaporous nothingness, along with the blood that had streamed down his body onto the floor. Sveta stood back and out of the way. Enoch's body stirred, twitched and contorted. His back arched out of the throne, and he let out a satisfied groan, like he was enjoying a stretch after a long sleep. "Ah, that's better." He relaxed and crossed his legs on the throne, his eyes gem-like and cold. They settled on the girl sitting across the room. "It's been a long time, Corey, but I finally found you. Come give your husband a kiss."